To kick things back off, we have Frank Hinek, who is another GT alum, talking about digital identity as one of blockchain's countless applications. As we've seen Web 2 progress, this idea of online pseudo-anonymity, in which a user's digital identity is connected to their online activities but has no traceback to their identity in real life, has grown. Despite this growth in online pseudo-anonymity, there is currently no infrastructure in Web 2 for traceback of identity. For instance, if someone rents online an R-rated movie, there's currently no way to tell if they're actually 17 in real life. Frank served as NCR's CTO of digital assets and now works as the platform and product lead at TBD. TBD believes in a decentralized future and is working to build the infrastructure that enables everyone to access and participate in the global economy. Please join me in welcoming Frank to the stage.
Yeah, thanks for spending some time. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and would love to chat with you afterwards. This is a conversation that will be keeping us busy for years to come. It's an area that's actually been a focus for a long time. The idea of decentralized identity is not new, but I think we do have an opportunity to make a pretty significant difference in a way that we just haven't had over the last many decades of endeavors, going all the way back to the early days of OpenPGP, for those of you that were around back then. So Frank Hinek, as was announced, my focus now is going to be on working with the TBD team to help create a decentralized platform that enables individuals to own and control their own identity, their finances, and their data. It's an opportunity to really, I think, change what was a false fork in some sense of the internet. So that's what we'll be talking about. These are my views. So not necessarily a TBD presentation, but not surprisingly, a lot of our views align and the mission aligns. So if I think about a lot of the talks, if you just look at the schedule for this weekend, a lot of what we're talking about is future-oriented. We believe in a future of the web that is open, that is interoperable, and that has a focus on user agency and on ownership, right? And if that's the future, then what's wrong with the web today? So to do, I guess, that a little bit of justice, let's go back in time. I had the fortunate opportunity to be at least a participant back in the early days of things like CC Mail and BBSs back in the late 80s, for those that remember those things. The early online email solutions, online auction solutions, a lot of these things that were part of the early web. But if we go all the way back to the beginning, really Tim Berners-Lee and the early community that founded that early web, really what they had a vision for would sound remarkably similar to the talks and the hallway conversations you're going to hear today, right? This is back in the early 90s. They believed in decentralization, and what they meant by that was really that there wasn't a central authority you had to go through to get permission to post, and you would be free from censorship and surveillance. They believed in non-discriminatory design. And that meant, what we would today call net neutrality. If you connect at high speed and I connect at low speed, we should still be able to communicate, right? A peer-to-peer internet. They believed in bottom-up design, so not a set of experts building something in a closed, proprietary way, but instead open source, open for access, open for contributions. Anybody could help build this environment. Universality, so the idea that all the computers should be able to speak the same language. And the point there was to encourage a diversity of ideas, but also to break down the silos if everybody could communicate. And consensus, not the blockchain consensus we think about now, but actually the standards. It's a huge problem. This is a decade-long journey, starting with the W3C back then, to create the standards we take for granted today. HTML, CSS, over at the IETF, things like TCP/IP and HTTP and all these protocols that we use. They seem like almost invisible now, but they were critical at that time to actually enable this, because back then there wasn't interoperability. But even if you look back at those times, those early creators of the web, they didn't solve for a number of things, right? As I think was just highlighted, there isn't a native identity layer on the internet. There's no native payments layer. And additionally, what a lot of the early builders discovered is that people don't like paying for stuff, right? They want everything to be free. It was just a hard concept to think about paying for digital services that, you couldn't touch and feel. And so, the next era was really marked by what today we look back and kind of call Web 2. And these builders came along and they solved for a lot of the things that were missing, right? They created a great user experience. They solved for data storage. They solved for collaboration. They solved for identity solutions. And, it was really transformational. It was a revolution in business models. It transformed how people had in terms of relationship with their work. And really it was significant because it wasn't just like the early web where it was like a one-to-many type of environment, really just like the publishers of a new era. This time in Web 2 was really transformative because average people could contribute, right? You didn't have to be an engineer or developer to get online and contribute. And, again, I highlight these things because they now are history, but at the time, these were things that were decisions that had to be made about how to do these, things, how to solve these really challenging issues. And ultimately, they were extremely successful. So successful, in fact, that by being able to have the ability to take all of this content that was created by individuals, right, the producers, the value creators, and present that in a way that the average person on the web could access, they were able to siphon off a huge amount of the value. And, ultimately, by around 2018 or so, roughly 7 of the 10 largest companies on the planet were actually technology platform companies. They weren't oil and gas, they weren't car companies, they weren't even the old tech like AT&T telecom companies. There were these platform organizations that, to be fair, solved a huge issue, right? They created an accessible web that just wasn't possible in the early days, but that came along with it, with some downsides. And a big part of that really is about having intermediaries, right? You see in this visual I created, part of the solutions to identity were things like centralized identity, federated identity, right? To boil it down, though, it was still an intermediary between you and your information. So we're all familiar with logging with Facebook, logging with Amazon, logging with Google, logging with whatever. Those created convenience, and people chose the convenience over ideology or protecting their privacy, but it also created a paper trail, right? And everything you interact with was collected by these organizations. And you traded that off for convenience. It wasn't a bad trade. We didn't do anything wrong as consumers. It was just the better way to do it. Same thing with payments. If you look at how payments were solved for, right, we do have the ability to pay for stuff online. At one point, that wasn't possible. That now is commonplace, but it wasn't a new solution. They essentially bolted onto the legacy financial system a digital interface to it. And unfortunately, while that created the utility, it created a bunch of downsides because now, in order to deal with things like fraud and chargebacks, they had to collect more information about us to protect themselves, right? And now suddenly, even if you were trying to pay for something that didn't require your name and home address, they had to get all this data because, if you reverse the charge a week later, 6 weeks later, how are they going to find you, right? So they had to collect all this information and store it for you. And ultimately, that was a debt-based system. All payments today are a function of delayed settlement. So for those that aren't familiar with kind of the crazy labyrinth of payments, every time you pay for something online, same thing in person, right? There's something like around a dozen parties that are there as part of that transaction that settle eventually the money from you, where you have it in some bank, to the merchant. Maybe you bought a t-shirt, right? And so ultimately all of that means that my credit worthiness as an individual actually dictates whether I have access to that system. And unfortunately, for millions of people in this country and many countries around the world, they are not credit worthy. And so they can't access the luxury of just being able to pay for things, even if they have the money. And, similarly with the data storage side of things, one of the solutions to us not having really great compute ourselves was to create these very scalable large data centers that were able to serve up these applications for us, right? And great user experiences, things we love today, our connections on a social graph, our music playlists, all of these things were wonderful, but they were solved in a way that was a function of the times, right? We did not have enough computing anywhere other than in data centers to run the applications, and so that's how they built those systems. The downside to that was that for a lot of people around the world who don't like cyberbullying, don't like online hate speech, don't like terrorism, all of these things that most of us probably would agree are not great things, these companies became a centralized choke point, right? If we're upset about them, somebody's got to do something. Who's going to moderate the content? Who's going to protect our data? Well, you only have to go through a handful of companies who have everything. And so they became kind of the centralized bottleneck, oftentimes not at their own choosing. I don't think a lot of them love to have this responsibility. And, they've paid tens of millions and in recent years, hundreds of millions of dollars of fines of losing our data and, making poor choices in terms of their designs. But ultimately, that was the only solution for it. And, ultimately over time, that kind of drove, what's somewhat of a provocative term, this idea of surveillance capitalism, but it is simply the reality, right? If you have a problem where your users don't want to pay, how do you make it free? Well, the way they made it free is they sold the information to advertisers. And so ultimately you have a model that's ad-based that, if you've ever heard the saying, if the product is free, you're probably the product. That is, the structure there. Again, this isn't necessarily done with an evil intent. It was a solution to a problem. If I can't charge you, I have to have money coming in from somewhere. Well, advertisers would love to get access to know what people like you buy and the types of things that maybe you would like to buy so they could send those things to you. Advertising in and of itself, not a bad thing, right? It helps us discover and find things, save money on things we want to buy. But when taken to an extreme, it becomes an opportunity for data breach, for loss of information, for loss of trust. And, ultimately, I think everybody's heard the term of software is eating the world, coined by Andreessen in 2011. On the web, it was really platforms ate the web, right? All of the traffic, if you look at it as a percentage, you put a pie graph up, the majority of it runs on about 5 different providers of compute services, and almost all of the data and identity solutions are from an even smaller number of providers. And, again, this is something that just was the way it was. We didn't have a better option at the time. So really, if that's the history, kind of what's next, right? We're all thinking about the future. What are we going to build together? And, hopefully part of the outcome of this conference is getting more students, members of the Atlanta community, members of the technology community to help contribute to changing the future. I think the idea of just being decentralized isn't enough, right? It's like, yeah, great, it's decentralized. Why does that matter? Why do we care about the decentralization? The goal isn't just the decentralization, it's actually what it might do for us. And so we're going to kind of walk through 3 areas, and we'll kind of focus on identity, but 3 areas that are tied to it. And in fact, all of these have at their core a need to establish trust, and that's where this identity layer comes in. So we'll kind of run through, what we're having as just the status quo today, right? We talked a lot about payments, so I won't belabor that point again, but there isn't a native layer there that exists on the internet. It was, left out. For those of you who are familiar with HTTP status codes, there's one that was there saying payment needed, never really implemented, right? The founders had the vision, it was just never followed through on. And, with identity, this isn't just a cyberspace or internet or web problem. In fact, this has always been this way. We've never had really ownership of our own identifiers, even in the real world. Your social security card, your driver's license, your passport, your national ID, all of those are identifiers really owned and controlled by the issuing entity. And you don't really have to go very far. Just talk to somebody who's ever been a victim of identity theft. You figure out how quickly the link between you as a person and your supposed identity is, how tenuous it is. It's extremely hard to get that back if somebody else says that they're you. And ultimately that creates a lot of challenges for an online network where you don't know who the other party is. You don't really have a way to validate who they are. And again, the solution has been we trust intermediaries, right? We allow them to basically manage that need to have some ability to trust. And I think a lot of us, the pseudonymity, the anonymity piece of the web is a great idea in concept, but there are some areas where it just breaks down. As an example, think of a truly decentralized Amazon, and you were going to go buy a $5,000 item. Would you be comfortable if you couldn't tell who the seller was, they didn't know who you were, and you had no guarantees that if you paid them, your product would ever show up? I mean, it just wouldn't work. That's not a functional economy. So we need some way to actually manage that. And again, how do we do that, though, without intermediaries, without kind of giving over control of that to somebody else? And, the data one is probably the most obvious one. It's become a little bit more, I think, in the general mindset around the challenges of centralized data parties, just because all of us is probably at some point, or if you haven't yet, you will get a notice, sorry, we lost your data. We're going to offer you a free year of identity protection. That's about the end of the story, and you have really no recourse there. And again, this isn't really something that the platform companies love to have this responsibility. It's just the only way we've been able to do it. So, we're here talking about decentralization, the new web, kind of what do we need? What are the fundamental primitives we need to build this new environment? So I'll kind of highlight 4 things. One is a reliable way to coordinate activity amongst a group of actors. A way to transfer value across time and space digitally that doesn't require an intermediary solution. A way to prove the provenance and integrity. That just means I can actually trust who's on the other end of something, and integrity means that it wasn't tampered with. And being able to keep the data as close as possible to the people and the groups that created it. So, if you guys have been in this space for a while, those sound like a lot of things that are a potential opportunity to leverage a blockchain. And what I would say is, yes, it is a component of that, and I think we're all working towards it. But the position I take is that the decentralized web is a superset. It's not just blockchain for everything. It's a superset of the solutions, and blockchain is just one tool for that. And so there are some areas that we'll highlight where it's absolutely a critical solution because of its characteristics, right? And if you think about what are probably the most salient things that were introduced back when the first arguably scalable blockchain was announced in 2009 that became functioning, Bitcoin. There have been many since that followed it, but there's 2 key things that I'll highlight. One of them is the consensus mechanism. So the consensus mechanism really is just how do we get a bunch of computers to agree on a shared state of data and then legitimate changes to that data over time. It's much more complicated than that, but that's the only part we need to worry about. And the other thing it came along with was actually a scalable distributed identity system. There had been identity systems for decades before this, but not one that was in the hands of tens of millions of people. And those 2 primitives really form the basis of what we need to coordinate economic activity between people, that private key material that we'll show how we can use that for identity and data usages. And ultimately, those capabilities applied are really great tools to solve some of these problems. And we think there's others that you're going to need beyond that. So again, let's just run back through these again, right? For payments, pretty obvious one, right? We actually now have a native peer-to-peer, purely digital solution, right, in the form of a global ledger. We have, for the first time ever, a single way to have everybody agree on who owns what value. And if I transfer value from me to you, I don't need to go to a trusted intermediary, right? And this is, revolutionary. It's, I think for those who have been in the space for a while, it's starting to become commonplace, but for 90-something% of the population, this is still huge, right? The 1400s introduced double entry accounting. For the first time, individual organizations could keep track of their books, but they still couldn't do that between 2 companies, right? Even today, every company has to reconcile their books with every other's. So this ledger is like a triple entry ledger. There's one global source of truth. And in that way, I don't need to trust you for me to send value to you. I can just record it, and then we all look at it, and we all agree that that's the truth. And the big, kind of aha moment, like, why does that matter? It's not just convenience or cool or fast or doesn't close on bank holidays. It's also for those tens of millions of people here and billions globally who don't have access to the financial system because they're not creditworthy. They can't use a debt-based system. And so for the first time, we have an ability to allow them to do that. And then you think of all the people today, I don't know the exact stat as it is right now, it keeps seemingly getting worse, but the number of people that live under an authoritarian regime today is astounding. And so the opportunity for censorship at the payments layer, for tracking and surveillance at the payments layer is significant. If we can do that in a way that doesn't require intermediaries, that's a big deal. And again, that is, foundationally based on this idea of public-private cryptography. That's how all of these systems function. That's how you can prove you own something. Those same keys have the power to unlock an identity revolution as well. For the first time ever, we can own our own identifiers, and I can actually prove who I am purely digitally without going through a third party, no intermediary, and I can then apply that in advanced ways in things that we could never do, even in the physical world. So being able to actually cryptographically prove I'm of a certain age or I have a certain license without actually sharing my private data with you, right? Things like zero knowledge proofs. The ability to actually selectively share. I only need to tell you a small bit of information to complete a transaction. I don't need to give you, my entire history, right? Think of like buying alcohol in a store. They don't need to know my first and last name, my home address, my driver's license. Like, why do people need that information? You're just trying to decide, am I greater than or less than, 21 or 18 or whatever the year is. So these capabilities of facilitating trust establishment while maintaining privacy are critical for a decentralized web. And on the data side, this is one that there are a lot of different approaches to it. A lot of people looking at putting more and more data on blockchains, people using the blockchain just for a time sequencing oracle, and there's a spectrum there. And I won't get into the argument between which one is, pros and cons on each side of it, but I think part of the idea behind this is really to flip the application model. Rather than data being on a server in somebody else's data center that you get access to, actually give the data back to the individuals, again, secured by cryptography, and then express that data through any application you wish. And, again, this is not decentralized just for decentralization's sake. It's actually better than it is today. Imagine a world where you can log in for the first time to pick a music app, right? You log in, there's no information there, it knows nothing about you, there's no playlist. You have to create all those things yourself. If you decide 2 years later to switch to another one, you have to go through and set that all up again. Right? Think about your social networks, right? When you first logged into Twitter, you had 0 friends. Back in the day, if you logged into Facebook, only you had one friend, Zuckerberg was your friend. You had to go build them all, right? LinkedIn, you had nobody. The idea of your social graph being yours, and you can change at any moment to a better user experience, better terms of service, a better product, without having to start over. If we own our own data, we can do that, right? I can one-click onboard and log into something and effectively rehydrate my entire set of data. And if I choose maybe to not trust that company anymore, I can take it back. I have that control and I can move. So I think that's a powerful model. That's, the decentralized web app approach that we've been building, and one that we're really excited about, just flipping that paradigm that's, I think, possible in a way that just hasn't been before. So, what's actionable about all of this stuff? We've talked about a lot. We've talked about how we can kind of change the nature of payments and data and identity with a new decentralized web. It's still early days, right? If you were to draw like the Geoffrey Moore, crossing the chasm, like we're probably at best in like the early innovator stage. We probably even haven't passed the first chasm. So I would encourage you, especially for students, to get involved, right? This stuff is not going to build itself, and we need a diversity of opinions and voices to help shape the future of this. So if you have an interest, connect to the open source community we're developing at TBD, all of the other organizations that are here, your local groups, the Atlanta Blockchain Center, the Georgia Blockchain Coalition, the 404 DAO, and the work that the team here that put on this conference is doing. Get engaged, get involved. You don't have to be a dev. There's lots of roles for people to contribute in many different ways. And the last thing I'll leave you is, I think when we look back on this time a few decades from now, it will be more transformative than we realize. It's one of the odd things about history. The people that live through the biggest changes don't tend to know about it, right? It's only historians later on that come back and tell us, and that was a big deal. And I think this is an opportunity, that you don't often get, to be part of a big change in history, to have an opportunity to actually get involved and shape it, not just as a participant, right? This is an open environment. Everybody can contribute. So I'd encourage you to take that opportunity, both for yourself and those that come after you. And with that, thank you very much.